Thank you, thank you. So early in the morning, too. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much for coming, and I appreciate very much this opportunity to visit with you, to talk about families. Obviously, family values are very, very important. And as was mentioned in the introduction, I've delivered a few babies, and that does contribute to family, let me tell you. But also, I'm from a rather large family. I have 4 brothers, but we have 5 children and 18 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren as well. It's fascinating to me when we bring new life into the world or a new baby comes into the family, has always been the reaction of the sibling, maybe 1, 2, or 3 or 4 years old. I was always fascinated with the intrigue of a sibling looking at a small baby.
And I thought, well, that was natural and good, and it really symbolizes what a family is all about. Unfortunately, our families have been under attack, and I have a few ideas about why that has occurred and what we might do about it. But the value of the family was something that was early described in the Bible. And there's one reference to the family that I thought was very important. That was in Samuel, the 1 Samuel chapter 8. And this is when the people, not the elders, came to Samuel when he was very old, and they knew he would be passing on. So the people came and said to Samuel, what we need is a king. We need a king to take care of us. We want to be safe and secure. And Samuel, although he knew he wasn't going to be around long, he advised the people of Israel not to accept the king, because the king, he warned, would not be generous. It would undermine their liberties. There would be more wars. There would be more taxes. And besides, accepting the notion of a king would reject the notion that up until that time, since they had left Egypt, their true king was their God and the guidance from their God. But the governing body was the family, and they did not have kings, but they had judges, and that's what Samuel was. But this was the time there was a shift away from the judges and the family into a king. And I think a lot of that has happened to us in this country. We have too often relied on our king in Washington, and we have to change that. But Samuel warned that the king would want to make servants of the people. And he even talked about taxes going up. And he talked about the use of young men being drafted. He talked about the women and young women being used by the king. And the warning was not heeded, as Samuel didn't expect it to be heeded. But he also said that if you depend on the king, the morality of the people will be rejected. The emphasis on the people themselves, the morality should come from the people and not from the king. And generally, it doesn't work that way. You know, morality of the people, or the lack of morality of the people, can be reflected in the law. But the law never can change the morality of the people. And that is very important. In the 1960s and the 1970s, there were dramatic changes in our country. During the Vietnam War, there was a lot of anti-war sentiment. There were a lot of drugs. This was the decade that abortion was done flagrantly against the law. And lo and behold, the laws got changed after the morality changed. But it was also about the time we had Roe versus Wade, we also had the breakdown of our monetary system. The rejection of the biblical admonition that we have honest weights and measures and honest money. And not to have honest weights and measures meant we were counterfeiting the money and destroying the value of the money. Which implies, even in biblical times, they weren't looking for a central bank that was going to counterfeit our currency. But the culture certainly changed. The work ethics changed. The welfare state grew. And it wasn't only for the poor who were looking to be taken care of, but we finally ended up with a system where the lobbyists were from the rich corporations and the banks that would come to Washington and expect to get their benefits, and the whole idea of a moral society changed. But you know, biblically there's a lot of admonitions about what the family should be in charge of. Certainly the Ten Commandments tell us something about honoring our parents and caring for them. It didn't say work out a system where the government will take care of us from cradle to grave. No, it was an admonition for us to honor our parents and be responsible for them, not put them into a nursing home and say the federal government can take care of them. Besides, sometimes that leads to bankruptcies and the government can't do it anyway. So that responsibility really falls on us. In the Bible, in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, Christ was recognized to be the Prince of Peace. He was never to be recognized as the promoter of war. And he even said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be the children of God." He never said, "Blessed are the war makers." It was the peacemakers that we must honor and protect. Christ was very, very clear on how we should treat our enemies, and some days I think we quite frequently forget about that. Early in the history of Christianity, they struggled with the issue of war and peace because Christ taught about peace. Did that mean Christ was advocating pacifism? The early church struggled with this and came to the conclusion, at least in those early years, that Christ was not a pacifist, but he was not a war promoter. And this is when they came up with the just war principles, saying yes, war could be necessary, but only under dire circumstances, and it should be done with great caution. All other efforts should be exhausted before we go to war, and always under the proper authority. And today, I think the proper authority is not the UN or the NATO forces that take us to war. We are taught in the New Testament about caring for the poor and caring for our families and our neighbors and friends. But never did Christ say, you know, this, go and lobby Rome to make sure that we're taken care of. It was a personal responsibility for us. Christ was confronted at one time by a prostitute, but he didn't call for the centurions. He didn't call for more laws. But he was very direct and thought that stoning was not the solution to the problem of prostitution. So do laws take care of these things, or do we need a better understanding of our Christian values and our moral principles? Life is most precious. I talk about life and liberty. I defend liberty to the nth degree, as long as people aren't hurting, killing each other, and stealing and robbing. But you cannot defend liberty unless you have a clear understanding of life. And believe me, as an experienced physician and knowing how to the responsibility of taking care of life from the earliest sign of life, I know legally and morally I have a responsibility to take care of two lives. And therefore, you cannot be a great defender of liberty if you do not defend and understand what life is all about and where it comes from. You know, the many great religions, and especially both the Old and New Testament, talks about a golden rule. And I think it's an important rule. We should treat other people the way we want to be treated. And I would like to suggest that possibly we should be thinking about having a foreign policy of a golden rule and not treat other countries any way other than the way we want to be treated. There were great dreams by Isaiah in the Old Testament about the time that would come when the swords would be bent into plowshares and spears into pruning forks. The dream of ending the wars and to the point where peace is prosperous. And I have come to a strong conviction that one of the most greatest threats to the family is war. It undermines the family. Just in our last decade, an undeclared war that we're dealing with, we've lost over 8,500 men and women in our armed services. We have 40,000 who have returned, many of them with severe amputations, and is in essence forgotten by the general population of this country. We have literally hundreds of thousands begging and pleading for help. I talked to a young man the other day, and he was telling me about losing all his buddies and his frustration with the war and not having a goal to winning the war and not knowing when it would end. And yet, his conclusion was, almost in tears, he said to me, he says, I lost my buddies over there, but now I'm losing many of them to suicide. And when you think of this, of what the consequences of war, the death and destruction, what does it do to the families? What does it do to the husbands and the wives and the mothers and the daughters who have to deal with these problems? So yes, it is very, very damaging. War costs a lot of money and causes a lot of poverty. Poverty and the economic crisis in this country is undermining the family. But $4 trillion of debt has been added in the last 10 years to fight a war that seems to have no end. Wars generally lead to inflation, the destruction of money. We don't honor the biblical principles of honest money. We invite this idea that we can spend endlessly and we can print the money, and literally it undermines the family and undermines the economic system. When you lose a job, it's harder to keep the family together. Divorce rates are very, very high among the military because these young men are being sent back 2 and 3 and 4 times. And there was one story told me about a little boy. He was 10 years old, and his dad was getting ready to go back again. He was screaming, I hate Daddy, I hate you, Daddy, because he was leaving him. So this is why in the early church they talked about being very careful about going into war, and also to be thinking about the admonition that peace is far superior to war. That should be our goal.